Elnora Vance had carried eggs to the store for 22 years. Every week, down the same rutted road in the same wicker basket, in heat and in frost. And every week she came home with coffee and salt and kerosene, and a little coin held back that no one ever saw. Then one night, at the supper table, her husband looked up from his account book and said it. "It's only egg money, Nora. Leave the figuring to me." She did not argue. She never did. She set the coin back in the blue-banded crock in the cellar, and she salted the flour over it, and she said nothing at all. The census man came that same autumn. He stood at her own front door, pencil moving, and beside her name he wrote 2 words. Occupation, none. She was standing right there, 40 hens behind her, and 120 more coming. 11 cents a dozen, butter and garden truck, and 20 years of trade. And the man wrote none, and moved on to the next house. But here's the thing they none of them knew. There was money on that place that never touched his account book. Money nobody had thought to write down, and the winter was coming when the cattle would freeze standing up in the drifts, and the note would fall due, and the only money left alive on the whole half section would be the money nobody had ever bothered to borrow against. If you believe it's never too late for the heart, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one find you where you sit tonight, subscribe. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I read them. I'd like to know who's out there in the dark with me. Now, back to Nora. It was the fall of 1886, out on the Nebraska plains, in a place they called Larkin County. Flat land under a big cold sky. Wheat stubble and cattle and the wind that never truly stopped, only rested a while and came back. Silas Vance had married Elnora in a church with the doors open 22 years before. He'd been a lean young man then, with his father's half-section under his boots and his whole life in front of him. She'd been a girl who could make anything grow. There had been love in it once, the kind that laughs in the dark, the kind that plans. But love, if you let it, will quiet down into routine, and theirs had. 22 years will do that. The land was still mortgaged, his late father had seen to that, and Silas worked it hard, the wheat and the beef, the things a man could show another man. Those were the real things to Silas. Those went in the book. Nora had her own department. The hens, first of all, 40 of them, brown and busy, and she knew each one. The butter she churned in the cool of the morning. The garden truck, beans and squash and the potatoes she dug herself. She carried all of it to town, to Amos Teal's general store, and she traded it there. And she could figure. Lord, she could figure. Amos would be reaching for his pencil and his paper, and Nora would already have it done. 12 dozen eggs against a sack of coffee, a tin of kerosene, 4 yards of calico for a dress. Credit here, credit there, carried in her head to the quarter cent. She never wrote a word of it down. She didn't have to. The whole ledger lived behind her eyes, and it was never once wrong. "You're quicker than my book, Mrs. Vance," Amos said to her one afternoon, laughing. She only smiled and hitched the basket up her arm. "Now here is the small thing, the thing you must remember later." Out of every trade she made, Nora kept 1 coin back. Just 1. A dime, most weeks. Now and again a $50 if the butter ran high. Not for anything. She couldn't have told you what for. Only that it was a comfort to have hard coin in a house that ran entirely on credit and promises. She carried each coin down to the cellar. And there, on the low shelf behind the potato bin, sat the blue-banded crock. Stoneware, glazed the color of a winter sky. A stripe of deep blue round its middle. It had been her mother's. She'd drop the coin inside, and she'd take a handful of flour or a fistful of salt and scatter it over the top, so that if a body ever lifted the lid they'd see only meal and think nothing. She never counted it. She only ever added to it. 20 years, and she'd never once tipped it out to sea. It wasn't for counting. It was just for keeping. That autumn the account book at the supper table grew thick. Silas had made up his mind to buy more cattle. Beef was the way, he said. Beef and wheat. The way his father had done it. So he went to the Drovers and Merchants Bank of Larkin County, and he signed his name, and he borrowed against the herd he had and the crop he'd raise. Everything he owned was pledged now. Every hoof and every acre spoken for on paper. Nora had her own plan, quieter. She had a broody hen gone to setting, and she'd slipped 13 eggs beneath her in the dark of the coop. 21 days, and she'd have chicks. Do that through the winter and the spring, and 40 hens would become 120. She'd doubled the flock before. She'd do it again. That was her book, and it balanced too, in its way. But you already know how Silas saw it. It's only egg money, Nora, over the account book. Not even cruel about it, just tired, and sure, leave the figuring to me. And she set her cup down, and she said nothing, and the fire popped in the stove. It came to a head at the store. It usually does, in front of people. There was a man named Alton Pruitt, came out from the bank to see about the county's paper. A collection agent. Clean cuffs, cold eyes, a leather book of his own. He'd cornered Silas by Amos Teal's counter, and there were neighbors about, the Kesslers, Old Man Doane, and Pruitt was reading Silas's obligations out loud. The note. The interest. What was owed, and when. Then his eye fell on Nora's egg basket, sitting there on the counter where she'd set it. 12 dozen, packed in straw. And this? He said. A small smile. The poultry? He didn't even ask her. He asked the room. Poultry don't signify, gentlemen, not toward a family's standing. Hen money. He made a little note. We don't count it. And Silas, her Silas, who'd married her with the doors open, Silas looked at his boots and said not one word. The room agreed with the silence. Old Man Doane nodded. The Kesslers looked away, embarrassed for her, which is its own kind of unkindness. Nora did not cry. She would not give them that. She lifted her basket, and she thanked Amos in a steady voice. And she walked out into the cold with her back straight as a fence post. But something had turned over in her chest, quiet and hard, like a stone settling to the bottom of a well. Winter came early that year, and mean. By November, the roads were slop, and then iron. Feed ran short and dear. And a strange thing began to happen at the Vance table. The coffee that stayed hot of a morning, that was Nora's, traded for eggs. The kerosene in the lamp Silas read his account book by, hers for butter. Through that whole hungry November, the only thing keeping salt and light and warmth in the house was the very department Pruitt had said didn't signify. And Silas noticed. She caught him watching her one evening. Amos had let her run a three-way trade, eggs to the store credit to the Doanes for a side of pork, the balance carried forward against spring seed. She'd done it in her head, standing at the stove, faster than Silas could have worked it with a pencil and a full hour. He sat there with his book closed, watching his wife's mouth move over the numbers, and something moved behind his face that hadn't moved in years. He said her name that night, going up the stairs. Just her name, Nora, but he said it different, softer, like a man setting down something he'd been carrying wrong. It didn't last. Fear undoes a man. The note sat on the shelf like a loaded thing, and the cold kept coming. And one bad night in December Silas came in from the barn with ice in his beard and worry riding him hard. She'd asked him a small question about the seed money. That was all. And it came out of him again, the old line, sharp this time. It's only egg money, Nora. He threw his gloves on the table. God Almighty. Leave the figuring to me. But she was a different woman than she'd been in October. The stone at the bottom of the well had grown. She looked at him. Level, calm as the flat land itself. "Then it's the only money," she said. "You never wrote down." He stopped. Glove half off his hand. He looked at her like he hadn't quite heard. But she'd heard herself. And in that moment, standing in her own kitchen with the wind clawing the window, Nora understood a thing she had never once let herself understand in 22 years. All that time she had thought her invisibility was only a wound. Occupation, none. Don't signify, leave the figuring to me. She'd carried it like a bruise that never healed, but a thing no one counts is also a thing no one can claim. Silas had pledged every acre and every steer to the bank, every real thing, spoken for. But not the hens, not the butter, not the coin in the crock in the cellar, salted over, 20 years deep, that no ledger in Larkin County knew existed. Nobody had borrowed against it. Nobody had thought to. Because nobody had ever thought it was worth a thing. She turned toward the cellar door. Her heart was going hard now. There was a candle on the shelf, and a low blue crock behind the potato bin, and she had never in 20 years lifted the salt to see what lay beneath. She thought it was time she found out exactly what she was worth. The cellar was cold as a grave and smelled of earth and old potatoes. She lit the candle. The little flame leaned, then stood. She went to her knees behind the potato bin. The blue-banded crock sat where it always sat, low on the shelf, a crust of salt gone hard across its mouth. She broke the crust with her thumb. She lifted the flour sack. And there it was. 20 years of coin, gone dark and dull in the dark. She poured it into her apron. Then she began to count, dime by dime, $half by $half. Quarters worn smooth, a few old silver bits, one Liberty dollar from a year the butter ran high. Her lips moved. She kept the store ledger in her head to the quarter cent, and she kept this too now, stack by little stack across the cold floor. $214. She sat back on her heels. The candle burned. $214 in hard silver, in a house that ran on credit, in a county where a dollar coin was a thing men talked about. She did not run upstairs. She did not call his name. She looked at the silver a long while. And she decided, alone, on her knees, that this money would not go into Silas's account book. Not yet. Not until it had to. She poured it back. She salted it over. She climbed the stairs and said nothing. Then came the snow. It came in January, and it came like the end of the world. The old-timers would call it the winter that killed the plains. The wind stood up out of the north and did not lie back down for 3 days. Nora hung a quilt over the door. The kerosene ran low. The stove ate everything they fed it and stayed cold at the edges. And the cattle. Silas's cattle. The bank's cattle, truly, every hoof of them pledged. They stood in the drifts with the snow driving into them, and they froze where they stood. Silas went out on the second morning and came back white to the eyebrows and could not speak. He sat down at the table. He put his head in his hands. Nora saved one thing through that storm. The broody hen. 13 eggs under her, 21 days to hatch, and 8 days still to go. Nora carried her in from the coop against her own chest, hen and eggs both, and set her in a box behind the stove. The hen fussed. Nora put her hand over the warm feathers and held her still. Silas watched from the table. He did not say it's only egg money. He watched his wife save something living while everything he counted died in the drifts, and he said nothing at all. The note fell due on the 15th. $528 to the Drovers and Merchants Bank of Larkin County. Every asset that backed it was dead in the snow. Pruitt rode out 4 days after the storm broke. He had a paper in his coat, and it was not a bill. It was foreclosure. The cattle were gone, so the bank reached past them for the thing underneath. The land. The half section. Silas's father's ground and his father's before. Pruitt stood in the kitchen and would not sit. The collateral's dead, Mr. Vance, the papers called. The bank'll take the land against it. He looked almost sorry. Almost. I'll want you off by the thaw. Silas did not argue. That was the worst of it. The man just folded up, 22 years of pride, and it went out of him like breath. When Pruitt rode off, Silas turned to her, gray in the face, and said, "Pack what's yours, Nora. We're done here." He had counted them out. He had done the figuring, the way he always said he would, and the figuring said they were finished. She let him say it all. She let him get to the end. Then she went down to the cellar. She came back up with the blue-banded crock held in both arms against her apron, and she set it on the supper table beside his account book. Salt still crusted on its rim. She looked him in the eye. And she tipped it over. The silver came out across the boards in a long, bright rush. It ran and spread and rang against the wood and kept coming. Dimes and halves and quarters and one old Liberty dollar, more hard coin than Silas Vance had held in his two hands in a year, spilling out across the table in the lamplight. He stood up so fast the chair went over. He stared at it. He did not touch it. He looked at the silver, and then he looked at his wife, and his mouth worked before anything came out. Where? His voice broke. Where did this come from? The department you never counted, she said. He reached out. Then he stopped himself. He did not sweep it up. He did not put it in his book. For the first time in 22 years of marriage, Silas Vance asked his wife a question instead of telling her the answer. "What do we do?" She began to gather the coin back into the crock, one handful at a time. "I'll carry it to town," she said. Myself, the bank office was cold and full of men. 2 neighbors stood by the stove. A clerk scratched at a book. Pruitt sat behind his desk with his own leather ledger open, and the ledger was nothing but paper, notes and scrip and dead collateral, in a winter when coin had gone to ground all across the plains and a bank could not lay hands on real money to save its life. Nora set the blue-banded crock on his desk. She took off the lid. She counted it out in front of them. Stack by stack. $214 in hard silver, ringing on the wood. Pruitt looked at it the way a thirsty man looks at water. "This is specie, Mr. Pruitt," she said. Coin, not scrip, not a note, not a steer that froze in the snow. Coin, good in any panic in the country. She squared the last stack with 2 fingers. "You called the paper because the collateral died. I'm offering good faith payment in the one thing your bank can't get anywhere else this winter. You can't foreclose on land against silver on the desk. You know it, and I know it." The room had gone dead quiet. Pruitt's jaw moved. He counted the silver with his eyes, and then he counted it with his hands, twice, because he could not help himself. He was a coin-starved man in a coin-starved bank, and here was a woman's crock full of the only real money in Larkin County. "You wrote down everything on our place," Nora said, quiet, "but the one thing that was real." He renewed the note. He had no choice, and everyone in that room watched him have no choice. The men who had stood at Amos Teal's store and nodded when a woman's work didn't signify. They watched a woman's uncounted coin do what a whole herd of cattle could not. And then Pruitt did the thing that mattered most. He dipped his pen. And in the ledger that had never once held her name, in his own cramped hand, he wrote it. Received in specie. Mrs. E. Vance. The book corrected itself. She stood and watched the ink dry, and she did not gloat. She only watched her name go into the record at last. Word went round the county before the thaw. Amos Teal, who had credited her eggs for 20 years and called it helping out, stood behind his counter and did the sum he'd never done. 20 years of eggs, of butter, of garden truck, all the helping, and could not meet her eye when next she came in. But the beat that mattered happened on the wagon home. Snowlight, the two of them alone on the road, the horse's breath standing white. Silas drove a while and said nothing. Then he stopped the wagon. In the middle of the road, in the cold, he stopped it. He held out the reins. And he held out the account book, the one he'd never let her near, the one where the figuring lived. "Take them," he said. She looked at him. "I never counted you, Nora." His voice was rough. He looked straight ahead, at the white road. 22 years. "I said leave the figuring to me, and you let me, and the whole time you were the wall the house stood on, and I never once saw it." He pressed the book into her hands. "I'd like to learn how. If you'll teach me." She took the reins. She took the book. She did not make it easy for him, and she did not make it hard. She let him pay what it cost, which was the truth, said out loud, in the cold. Then she clicked to the horse, and she drove them home. Spring came the way it always comes, slow and then all at once. The snow went off the fields and the ground turned black and wet, and behind the stove, in her box, the broody hen came off her nest. 13 eggs. 21 days. Nora lifted her and looked, and there they were, 13 chicks, wet and blind and cheeping. The whole future of the flock that would grow from 40 hens to 120 and more. On the kitchen table now there were 2 account books, hers and his, side by side, both open. Hers kept in coin, his kept in credit. And when the eggs were ready to go to town that week, it was Silas who took up the wicker basket and carried it out to the wagon himself. Nora stood in the doorway and watched him go. The money they never wrote down was the only money nobody could take, and the woman they never counted was the wall the whole house stood on. If there's a soul in your life whose work goes uncounted, the one who keeps it all running while nobody writes it down, go on and count them. Out loud. Before the snow. And if you know a county like Larkin, a place where the winters bite and the good folks go unthanked, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I'd like to know where you're standing. That summer the kitchen table stayed that way. Both books open, both counted. Silas had a way of sitting there in the evenings now, after supper, with his pencil and his credit columns. And he would ask her things. Not report them. Ask them. What did teal give per dozen in July? What the extra pullets were worth by fall? What she thought they should do with the remainder after the note payment in October? She told him. He wrote it down in his hand, her figures, in his book, and that was the new accounting. The flock climbed. 40 hens by the spring killing had grown to 60 through the summer and would reach 90 by the following March. She had been right about the 13 eggs. She had always been right about the 13 eggs. It had only taken a blizzard and a banker and a table full of silver to make anyone look. Amos Teal saw it first, the way he always saw small things before they arrived. In July she came in with 2 baskets instead of 1, and he met her at the door before she had to ask. He had made a space on the counter. He called it her account, not the family account, her name on the card in his own writing, Mrs. E. Vance, and he added it to the board where the other accounts were posted, where anyone who came in could see it. He did not make a speech about it. He just moved a card from one drawer to another and handed her the butter tally. That was Amos. In October, Silas paid the note himself, on time, and the amount was not the full $400 remainder, it was $412, with $12 of that coming from her column. Pruitt received it without a word. He entered it the same way he had entered the silver, received in coin, Mrs. E. Vance. The ledger did not editorialize. Ledgers never do. That was all she had ever wanted from one. The winters after that were still hard the way Nebraska winters are hard, cold that finds every gap in the wood, mornings when you break ice for the stock before you've had coffee, springs that lie to you twice before they keep their word. But the land held. The house held. And the woman who had always been the wall the house stood on finally had her name on the wall.